On the second video on forces and how they act on architectural structures, I want to look at the arch. So just to remind you, the two main forces we're talking about are compression and tension. And this is also a reminder of how the different materials handle tension and compression. So I want to start off by introducing you to this amazing architectural gem. This room, which is a forest of columns and arches, is found in southern Spain in the city of Granada. And on top of a hill in Granada is this amazing fortress and palace that was originally built by the Moors who had conquered Spain at this time period. And it has beautiful Moorish architecture. And in particular, you see these beautiful, fabulous arches here. And these are actually, the design is actually a Moorish arch. If you want to know a little bit more about why this is called a Moorish arch, you can do a little research on that if you wish. But you have all these fabulous stone arches that are then also resting on these amazing columns. The thing to note is that this room is filled with columns. It's a forest of columns, so it's not a big open space like a modern structure. And once again, that's partly the limitation that you have by using stone as a building material and also using arches and columns as structural elements. But we'll look at that a little bit later in the course. So let's start off with the most basic type of arch, which is called the Roman arch. It's a semicircular arch. There it is here. And you can see in this case it's made up of all these individual blocks of stone. And typically stones make up arches. This particular stone at the top is called the keystone. It's the last stone that's put in. But you have all these individual blocks that make up the arch. Now, the fact that this is made out of stone might tell you that in actual fact the only force that's happening in here is compression, because stone is very strong compression. So when you apply a load down onto this structure, that force is transferred through the stone arch, the stone blocks, or through the arch like this, and then it ends up coming out at a bit of an angle at the bottom of the arch. So this is fantastic because it can open up a reasonably large space here, and you don't have to worry about it using a beam where it might bend and break, because all of the stone is in compression, and stone is extremely strong in compression. So that's one of the major advantages of using an arch. Now the downside of a Roman arch, though, is you can see that this force is sort of coming out at an angle. So you've got to support that. So what it requires is a lot of support on the sides of a Roman arch, so the arch just doesn't collapse. So here again is the load or the weight on top of the arch. Then you can see how the force is transferred through the arch by the red arrows, and then it's coming out the bottom. And this semicircular arch is typically called a Roman arch, because the Romans, although they didn't invent this arch, were major pioneers. They really took the arch to new places that no one else had ever taken before, and you'll see a lot of arches in Roman architecture. So the Roman arch has been used for thousands and thousands of years. And after the Roman Empire collapsed, you had the Byzantines who continued to use the Roman arch. The Arabs inherited that architecture, and we saw on one of the first slides how they built a lot of their architecture using a version of the Roman arch. But it was in the sort of middle to late Middle Ages that someone came up with a new style of arch. So when you look at churches, particularly churches in Europe in the early Middle Ages, they all use the Roman arch. And then there was this major revolution in architecture, which we call Gothic architecture, where a new style of arch, the Gothic arch, was used. And you'll notice that it is a pointed arch. And this, believe it or not, has a big impact on how the forces are transferred through the stone. So when you put a load on top of an arch, a Gothic arch, just like in Roman arch, that force is transferred through the stones. All the stones are in compression, but the angle at which that load leaves the arch is almost vertical. Whereas remember, in a Roman arch there's a lot of lateral, the force is lateral when it comes out of the arch. Now, why is that important? Well, let's look at the main influences or impacts of this more vertical load here. So in the early Middle Ages, you have what we call Romanesque architecture. And you can see that it has a Roman arch, and to support that, you need to have very, very thick walls on the sides of these structures. And the problem with that is that they need to be very thick, they need to be very strong, so it's a little challenging to put windows in here. In actual fact, you have to have very, very tiny windows here. So it's going to be very dark inside the structure. When they moved to using a Gothic arch, because the load is directed more in a more vertical direction, you can get away with having very thin walls. And in actual fact, you can also add other arches, which are called flying buttresses, off to the side like this, and transfer even more of the forces out to the side. And that led to these very graceful, tall, beautiful Gothic cathedrals. And the big advantage is that you can have these very, very narrow walls here. It also meant that you could raise Gothic cathedrals, the roof of a Gothic cathedral, much, much higher than a Romanesque church. So you ended up creating these large interior spaces, both vertically, or not so much, yes, extremely much higher vertically, and a little bit wider also horizontally. And the other big difference with Gothic architecture over Romanesque architecture is that because these walls were thinner, you could put in big open stained glass windows on the side here and let in a huge amount of light. In actual fact, they were called cathedrals of light for that very reason. Whereas with the Romanesque churches, which needed very, very thick walls, you could only put tiny, tiny little windows in. So here's an example of a typical Romanesque church. You can see all the Roman arches here. Notice the really tiny windows all over the place. Very, very small and very dark. And if we compare and contrast that to these massive Gothic cathedrals with their Gothic arches, their huge spaces where you can put massive openings in on the sides and put really big windows in, it's a completely different feeling. See all this light that is streaming in because you just have these very, very thin walls. It almost feels like the stone is floating. So the arch is still a very important structure that's used to sort of span spaces. So the key thing to remember is in an arch, most of them are made of stone, or they were, although now we use arches made often out of steel. But the material is completely in compression. There's no tension in an arch. And there are lots of different types of arches, so I challenge you to look around, see if you can find some examples of different types of arches and try and identify them this week. Okay, thanks.